If Adam and Eve were the first humans, where did Cain find a wife? It's a small line in Genesis that sparks one of the oldest questions Christians and curious readers keep asking. Cain kills his brother, receives God's punishment, and a protective mark is driven away, and then, suddenly, knows his wife and fathers a son named Enoch while building a city. Genesis 4:1-17, Genesis 4:16-17. How does that fit with the idea that Adam and Eve were the progenitors of the human race? Today we'll walk through the text, weigh the main possibilities, and try to hold mystery and humility together as we think about the Cain's wife, her mysterious origin. First, a quick recap of the narrative so we're all on the same page. Genesis tells us that Adam and Eve fathered Cain and Abel. Cain's offering is rejected, Abel's accepted, and jealousy leads Cain to kill his brother, the first recorded murder in the Bible. God confronts Cain, curses him in certain ways, yet also marks him so that he will not be killed by others. Cain departs from the presence of the Lord and settles east of Eden, where he builds a city, and where the text says he took a wife and had children, including a son named Enoch. Genesis 4:1-17. Then Genesis 5:4 adds a brief but important detail. Adam fathered sons and daughters after the birth of the named sons. That brief phrase is one of the key pieces of data that readers bring to this puzzle. If you enjoy digging into Bible mysteries like this, subscribe. There's more unpacking of Genesis and other texts coming soon. What does the text actually say, and what does it leave silent? Genesis 4:16-17 records Cain's exile, and then the concise line that he knew his wife. Genesis 5:4 says that Adam had other sons and daughters. Those are the core facts. The rest, how many children, how they were related, what social rules applied in those very first generations, is not spelled out. From that point of textual silence, several interpretations have been proposed. We can think of three major options, each with strengths and limits. 1. Cain married a sister or close relative, one of Adam and Eve's daughters. 2. Cain married a non-Adamite human, some other people created or existing outside the Eden narrative. 3. The phrase functions as a literary shorthand or theological focus, meaning the narrator is only tracking a particular family line and not providing an exhaustive ethnography. Let's take the first hypothesis. Cain married a sister, one of the daughters of Adam and Eve. This is the most traditional and widely held solution among conservative interpreters because it fits the straightforward reading of the Genesis narrative. Genesis 5:4 explicitly states that Adam begat sons and daughters, which suggests that Cain and Abel were not the only children. If Adam and Eve had many long-lived children, Genesis elsewhere speaks of dramatically longer lifespans in the early chapters, then marriages between close kin would have been a practical necessity for early population growth. The text itself does not condemn such unions in the first generations. In fact, later examples in Genesis show that marriage within extended family circles was normative for some time. The stories of Abraham and Sarah and of Isaac and Rebekah both show marriages within kin networks, Genesis 20, Genesis 24. After the flood, the population we are told about descends from Noah and his sons, again, a small initial pool from which humanity spreads, Genesis 9. There are strengths to this sibling-daughter explanation. It stays very close to the biblical text, relies on the verses that explicitly tell us Adam and Eve had more children, and it reflects a pattern of internal biblical evidence that early marriages within close kin groups were part of God's unfolding plan for human propagation. It also avoids requiring us to posit extra events or secret populations not recorded in Scripture. At the same time, there are limitations and important caveats. Modern readers rightly feel discomfort about close kin marriage, since later Mosaic law explicitly forbids unions of certain close relatives, see Leviticus 18. That legal prohibition appears centuries later in the biblical record, which suggests a development of social and religious norms over time, rather than an assumption that every practice in Genesis was permanently normative. The sibling hypothesis explains the data, without introducing any extra biblical entities, but it does require acknowledging that the moral and social frameworks we live by now were not identical to those in the early narrative moments of Genesis. Now consider the second hypothesis. Cain married another human who was not a descendant of Adam and Eve, some other people outside the Eden account. Some readers are drawn to this option because it seems to solve the "where did she come from?" puzzle without requiring sibling marriage. The suggestion takes different shapes. One form imagines that God's creative activity included other people made apart from Adam and Eve, who are not the focus of the Eden narrative. Another version posits groups or communities outside the garden story. The text of Genesis, focused on the line leading to Israel, might simply be silent about neighboring populations. It's crucial to treat this possibility with clear caution. The Bible itself nowhere explicitly says that there were other human beings created independently of Adam and Eve. When readers advance this view, they are drawing on inferences or on harmonizations with other ancient texts and mythic motifs, not on clear direct statements in Genesis. Because that is the case, responsible presentation requires labeling this option as speculative, an extra-biblical reading not spelled out in Scripture. Some find it attractive as a way to avoid endorsing early incest, but it introduces its own problems. It must explain why Genesis would omit any mention of these other people entirely, and how those people relate to God's covenant narrative if they are not part of Adam's lineage. The lack of explicit textual support makes this route possible only as a hypothesis to be weighed, not as something to assert as fact. That brings us to the third option, and perhaps the one that invites the most humility, the literary or theological reading. According to this view, Genesis is written with a particular focus and purpose. The book narrows its narrative lens to the family line and theological concerns that serve its larger aims, highlighting origins, covenant relationships, and the genealogy that leads toward the patriarchs. The phrase that Cain took a wife may be simply a narrative shorthand. The author is indicating that Cain married and that the line continued, without the intention of producing an exhaustive census of every person who lived at the time. Genesis frequently works by selecting names and events that are theologically significant, rather than offering a full sociological report. From this perspective, the presence of a named wife is important to the story's movement, but not designed to resolve modern questions about population dynamics or social rules. This literary explanation has its own strengths. It honors the mode of the biblical writer, selective, often genealogically organized, and it reminds us that ancient historiography and narrative operate differently from modern anthropological description. It resists forcing Genesis to answer questions the author may not have set out to answer. The limitation here is that this reading leaves the question open. It does not provide a concrete identification for Cain's wife, and for readers seeking a specific historical reconstruction, it can feel unsatisfying. But as an interpretive posture, it also protects us from overconfidence. Sometimes the text's silence should lead us into reverent uncertainty rather than speculative fillings. How do we weigh these options against each other? The strongest textual anchor is Genesis 5:4, which affirms that Adam had other sons and daughters. That verse makes the sibling daughters hypothesis both plausible and textually economical. The literary reading is also well supported. Genesis is selective and genealogically driven, and it would not be surprising for the narrator to omit details irrelevant to the main theological line. The other humans theory remains a live possibility for some readers and scholars, but it lacks explicit biblical endorsement, and so must be treated as speculation. It's helpful to consider the broader biblical pattern about marriage and law. Later legal material, particularly Leviticus 18, spells out prohibitions against various close-kin relationships. Those laws come centuries after the events narrated in Genesis and reflect a developed social legal matrix applicable to Israelite community life. The existence of later prohibitions suggests that the biblical authors themselves viewed some practices as evolving in moral and legal status over time. A practice that appears in the early Genesis stories may not have been intended as a permanent prescription for all ages. Likewise, the post-flood narrative focuses the human family through Noah's sons, again a small starting population, without providing exhaustive details about how marriage norms functioned in the centuries that followed. Genesis 9. The patriarchal narratives, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, show marriages within family networks as the primary means of maintaining lineage and covenantal continuity. Genesis 20, Genesis 24. These comparative data points make the siblings' daughters' hypothesis congruent with the overall narrative trajectory. Another angle people sometimes bring up is the practical matter of cities and communities. Cain building a city may seem out of place if the population is just a handful of people. But a city in Genesis can simply signify a settled place, an act of social organization, or a mark of Cain's attempt to create a new life away from his parents' home. Genesis uses the word to indicate a locus of habitation and identity. We should resist importing modern population expectations into these ancient narratives. Throughout this discussion, two methodological cautions must guide us. First, never elevate compelling speculation into doctrinal certainty. The text itself leaves space. When Scripture is silent or brief, the humble posture is to recognize the limits of what we can know with confidence. Second, avoid reading later legal texts back into the early chapters, as if the norms and contexts are identical. Genesis tells a story of beginnings. Leviticus issues law for a later covenant community. The relationship between narrative and law in Scripture is complex, and recognizing historical development in the text helps us navigate apparent tensions. So what can we conclude? The question, who was Cain's wife, does not have a single unequivocal answer spelled out in Genesis. If pressed for the option most tightly anchored to the text, the simplest and most straightforward reading is that Cain married one of Adam and Eve's daughters, or a close relative. Genesis 5:4 provides direct support for the existence of additional children, and the early narratives show marriages within family networks. The literary theological explanation is also persuasive, reminding us that Genesis is not trying to be an exhaustive ethical or demographic treatise, but is shaping history for theological purposes. The other humans theory remains possible but extra-biblical and speculative. It should be presented as a hypothesis, rather than a claim of scriptural fact. What does this mean for faith and for everyday readers? First, questions like this can deepen our engagement with Scripture if we hold them with humility. Mystery is not the enemy of faith. It can be the soil where faith grows deeper when it's tied to careful reading and reverent curiosity. Second, this particular puzzle does not overturn any central biblical claims about God, sin, redemption, or human dignity. Whether one favors the siblings' explanation, the literary reading, or remains open to speculative alternatives, the theological core of Genesis, human responsibility, the reality of sin, God's justice and mercy, remains intact. If you've wrestled with this before, which explanation do you find most convincing, and why? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's keep the conversation respectful and curious. If you found this unpacking helpful, like the video and consider watching the next one, where we look at how the genealogies in Genesis shape the larger story of Scripture. Finally, a brief pastoral word. It's healthy to ask difficult questions about the Bible. Approach the text with honesty and with humility, and let the puzzle draw you into a deeper study rather than a quick dismissal. The Scriptures invite us into a lifetime of learning, and some of the oldest questions will continue to teach us how to read carefully and live humbly. Thanks for joining this exploration of the Cain's wife, her mysterious origin.